Welcome. We have lost a giant, and it is important to remember together and to tell each other the stories, and to think about the legacy and what we're carrying on. So I want to thank especially Alice Kessler-Harris, who somehow got the bureaucracy to say, yes, you can do this, when it was totally not in the original plan. And she asked Bill and I to put it together. Most people know there's also going to be a session at the Berks. So this is chapter 1. And I know there are many other times and places when these memories will go on, and so there'll be a lot more. But Bill and I are grateful that you asked us to do this. Alice, thank you. So I'm going to let Bill explain how we're going to proceed. And those of us who are on the panel, get 5 minutes. And then after that, each of you can come up and take 2 to 4, 2 to 3, something quick. But to give each other, we need to share the stories. And that's why we're together.
Oh, wait a second. I have my yours is your beat. We're trying to get organized. I want to also thank Alice and Linda Kerber and others who were so involved in making this all possible. The format's going to be as follows. I'm going to share some reminiscences with you, and then Sara is, and then Elizabeth Minnich, and Linda Gordon, and Thavolia Glymph. And we, as I say, we hope to be finished by 5 o'clock, and then have all of you be part of this as well. I knew Gerda for 43 years, and she was an extraordinary presence in my life. I met her first in 1971 at the OAH meetings. I had just finished my dissertation, and Gerda was, I met her around the issue of women's history, and she was so incredibly supportive. And she was in the lead of a generation of people who welcomed me as a male into the sorority of women's historians. And that meant an enormous amount to me. And there are many people in this room who are part of that community, and it was a wonderful experience to be able to have that wonderful support group where we could all share our thoughts, helped to try to revolutionize the field, and hope to make a difference in the way in which American history would therefore, in the future, be viewed. I actually had the opportunity to spend a whole lot of time with Gerda after that. We were a part of a seminar at the Aspen Institute, which I was actually asked to moderate with Elizabeth Janeway. And Gerda was one of the 25 people in that community. And one of the great things about it was that every day, Gerda and I hiked the mountains. And I learned all about her life, which was extraordinary, because you know what an incredible life it was. And we just would talk and talk and talk for 3 hours at a time. And then we'd come back and we'd do our seminar. Well, the seminar had about 25 people in it and met for 3 weeks in a row. And there were very interesting different kinds of people in there. One of them was a famous psychologist whose last name was Gordon. I'm not going to say anything more than that. And he was on one side of the issues, and Gerda was clearly on the other side of the issues. And it was a very, very dynamic, contentious, wonderful seminar. And at the end, we had a skit, which we put on after 3 weeks. And we decided that there would be 2 main characters in the skit. One of them would be Dr. Famous Boredom, who was the author of this great book on parent effectiveness training. And the other was Gerda Asserter. And everyone, and Gerda loved it. She thought this was the most fitting, appropriate way to have her role in that commemorated. We kept on seeing each other, of course, and in 1982, Sara and I had the honor of being asked to be the co-chairs of the program committee for the first woman historian of the Organization of American Historians. And she said, we want to juice things up. So we had a dance, and we required, but Sara will say more about this, but we tried to do a different kind of program. We're still trying to do a different kind of program in the OH, but we tried. And we may have actually been as successful as anybody. And the last thing I want to say is that we had the opportunity to be very close to Gerda in the last 10 years of her life. She came to Chapel Hill, where she had family, and we saw her 4 or 5 times when she was there, had dinner. She had us at dinner, had a wonderful time during that period of time. And then after she came back from Vienna, when she was so sick, we had the wonderful opportunity to be with her a number of times and to sort of sustain and cement a relationship which was one of the most important in my life. So it was a great honor to be part of that. And now Sara will share with you, one of the things I wanted to say, is to read you a commentary about what Gerda did for all of us in women's history. This is from Glenda Gilmore. Mastering the historiography of a field is usually a dry exercise, but when I was in graduate school in the late 1980s, the historiography of women's history felt like rock climbing. A pioneering generation of women had chipped out footholds on the impervious history cliff, opening rich veins of intellectual inquiry for us to mine. Gerda Lerner's interventions ranged widely over time and place, and her theoretical insights armed my generation with fresh approaches to history. Best of all, the giants still walked among us. We could watch Gerda Lerner give a paper or hear Anne Ferris Scott comment on graduate student work. Neither suffered fools gladly, indeed, nor wavered in the conviction that studying and writing women's history amounted to the most important thing a graduate student could do. A widely circulated legend among graduate students, perhaps apocryphal, held that Lerner asked her own graduate students to call her Gerda because she said, quote, "I've never had any trouble commanding respect." The sheer bravado of that statement gave me the courage to think it possible to become a female academic and remain myself. Glenda Gilmore. Thank you.
I got to know Gerda a few years after Bill did in 1976. I think first when I came for a job interview at Sarah Lawrence College. And then she had the generosity, after I had turned down that job to go to the University of Minnesota, to invite me to be a co-faculty member with her in an institute she was leading at Sarah Lawrence for 3 weeks that summer. It was one of the very first institutes on the integration of women's history into the U.S. History Survey course, and this one was for secondary school teachers. That was probably the most intellectually powerful 3 weeks I had ever experienced. I got to know Alice. Alice came and gave lectures. Joan Kelly gave lectures on whether women had had a renaissance. And those of us who were there, basically Gerda sat us down and put us through. And then we went off and ran our own seminars, but she was putting us through a seminar in what is women's history. And like most of the people in my generation who were coming into a field that didn't exist, we were out there just sort of making it up on our own, just fumbling around and finding topics and doing it. Gerda had been thinking systematically about it for at least 10 years or more by the time she came into my life. So when she sat us down and said, what are the questions we have to ask? Where are the women? What are they doing? How do they do it? What is the technology of their daily lives? How do they define themselves and their place in the world? And she was just adamant. It won't do to read the prescriptive literature and think that's how women think about themselves. We know better than that. But now we have to dig really hard and figure it out. And finally, race and class are central. Women are not a unity. And she hammered at this. And if you read the people who won, the comments from the people who've won the Lerner Scott Prize after Gerda died, it's just wave after wave after wave of gratitude for that swath that she cut, that path she opened up, that permission to know that women are really different from each other and that you have to drill down into those particularities. At one point we had hoped Darlene Clark-Hine could join us on this panel, and I have a wonderful statement to that effect from Darlene. I told her we would like to read it, and she loved that. She thanks me and Bill for inviting her to participate in this memorial. She said it's impossible fully to convey the significance of Gerda's contribution to the field of African American women's history. Her Black Women in White America anthology became my Bible. I was in my office at South Carolina State College in Orangeburg, South Carolina, when in 1973-74, time has gotten really strange for me now. I mean, living through this amount of it and it feeling yesterday still. I first opened that amazing volume. I was in a trance for hours. Thus, Gerda became an inspiration to me long before I met her in person. I considered it a rare blessing when she invited me to work with her on a special project to increase the participation of Black women historians in the OAH and in the larger historical profession. The first FIPSI grant that she and I worked on cemented our friendship. I learned from her the importance of intellectual courage, professional perseverance, and solidarity. And over the years of collaborations and shared experiences and confidences, I embraced completely her truth. Yes, Gerda, incremental change can produce revolutionary consequences. How else can I explain my having become a president of the OEH without Gerda Lerner's brilliant scholarship, vision, fearlessness, and path-breaking leadership? And the other piece I just want to lift up is that Gerda set out in the beginning to transform our profession. That was a part of her revolutionary vision. And I have to say, I came into this out of the New Left and I was pretty anti-institutional. I didn't take very seriously professional meetings. I had an advisor who thought rather nostalgically about the days when particularly the American Historical Association was what he called a stag affair. And I was busy being in women's groups in the women's movement, and I really, frankly, wasn't gripped by that. But Gerda was, and I'm grateful to her, so grateful. She set out, she quotes herself in The Majority Finds Its Past. That's something Gerda could do a lot of, actually. But she remembers in the 60s telling her professors in graduate school, I want women's history to be part of every curriculum on every level, and I want people to be able to specialize and take PhDs in the subject and not have to say they're doing something else. I want women's history respected and legitimized in the historical profession. And by '69, she was already co-organizing the CCWHP and the first co-president of that. She was, as we said, we're pretty sure she was the first woman president of OAH. And Bill and I had the greatest time with everybody else who was on that committee. I think it was the most fun program committee this meeting has probably ever had, throwing a dance. And our mantra was, any session of all white men is a failure of imagination. And we were very free to tell people putting in proposals that they had to change their sessions. They had to get rid of this and add that, and we moved papers around. We didn't want to just turn people down, but we reconfigured things so that they could all have more different voices in them. And what failed was that we pleaded with people to stop reading their papers. We sent out this great letter saying, you know how to do this, you give lectures every week. You don't have to read every word, you can have notes. They didn't. The next person who will share memories of Gerda is probably the oldest friend of Gerda that I know anyway. Elizabeth got to know her back in the 60s, and she'll have to tell you about it. But the great thing is that Elizabeth is not a historian. She's a philosopher. Elizabeth Minnich, many of you may know, is a pioneering feminist philosopher who has stayed in both personal and intellectual conversation with Gerda for well over 40 years. And I think that's a voice that it's really helpful for us to hear too.
Thank you, Sara, and everybody for being here and for giving us a chance to have this kind of a memorial. It's the kind that Gerda would like. Actually, we were saying a little while ago that Gerda would have loved it if it were very small and intimate and everybody had a chance to talk, and she would also have loved it if it were huge and crammed. Loved them both, would have fussed a little about either. But she had such a range. She had such a personal range from being an extraordinarily good friend. She was always somebody that I could talk to about the hardest things in my life. She was wise, she was experienced, she was very funny. She had a lot of psychological depth and range, and I don't know how much that sort of showed publicly, but for those of you who knew her personally, I'm sure you encountered it. I counted on it for many, many years. And it's very difficult to lose it. And in honesty, I haven't had much chance to mourn her because I sort of put it away when I heard and went on with things. And I realized before this session that I'm sort of hoping I don't decide to mourn her right now. And not until we've had our chance to talk together. But it's an intense experience to do it, and I'm very glad to have a chance to do it with you. Gerda and I did manage to remain friends for a very, very long time, despite distance and the fact that, I was in certainly related work, deeply related work, but as a philosopher and somebody trying to figure out change the higher education system to welcome this new scholarship. And I used to drive her crazy, of course. I suppose we all did on occasion. And we probably knew when we'd done it, right? She would say something to me, and I would say, as I said to my friends here just a few minutes ago, yeah, but I don't do facts. And Gerda would say, what? You can't do that. And I would say, well, I trust you. You have the facts, just tell me what meaning you make of them. She'd say, you don't read my books. Well, I read every word of them because she used to send me chapters and all of that, but she was deeply convinced that I read the beginning and the end and just left the rest out of my faith that she got the facts right. But we had wonderful conversations, and I was intrigued by the range of her life, her mind, her heart, her political commitments. I know very few people who were as determined as Gerda to have the fullest possible life. And I think that had a lot to do with the depth and range of her scholarship. Nothing ever became desiccated or sort of merely professional or only in one conversation. She was always engaged. And then I have to tell you that that range of her life, which I do think it has great implications for her thinking and her writing, came out in interesting ways. Some of you were there, I'm sure, at her 80th birthday. I missed her 90th one, but at her 80th birthday, towards the end of it, we gathered in a smaller room in her wonderful daughter Stephanie's living room, and people started telling Gerda stories with Gerda. Gerda is a storied woman, I should say, in every meaning of the term. So people started telling Gerda stories, and they were personal, they were about physical adventures, they were funny, they were so forth. And many of them had to do with risk-taking, breaking boundaries, breaking barriers, and that you were sort of in danger when you were doing something with Gerda. My family was always worried I might not come back from one of my visits to her. I'll tell you just one quick story, and this is the kind that came out in the first session. That's what the first things people wanted to talk about was literally their adventures with Gerda, because she was always out there pushing some boundary or other. She wanted to go back to the Canadian Rockies that she loved. She loved to hike, as we were saying, did that with people she liked over and over again. So she wanted to go. She could no longer really walk. She had stenosis at that point. She could hardly stand. There was enormous pain. But she wanted to go to the Canadian Rockies, where you hike, okay? So I agreed to do that because it was very important to her. We went to the Canadian Rockies. Turned out to mean that we would get dressed in hiking clothes. I'm not an experienced hiker. We would get dressed in our hiking clothes. We would go out to one of her favorite trail. We'd get to the trailhead. We'd both get out of the car. We'd walk over towards the trailhead. Gerda would say, oh, Surprise. Oh, she would say, I can't do this. And she would sit down on a rock in the sun, pull out her book, point me up the trail, where I was reading signs that said, honest to God, the grizzlies are down. And they didn't mean like get down, you know. They were lower than usual on the mountains. So I would get launched up the trail, tremulous, sing, recite every poem I ever knew. You don't want to surprise a grizzly, you know. So, and then I'd come back, and you know, Gerda didn't think anything had happened. We'd go soak in some hot tub somewhere or something like that, and the next day we'd do it again. And I did it. So, you know, one time I slid down half a mountain with her, and I got such bad poison oak that the doctors thought I had an exotic tropical disease. So really, truly, my family was worried when I went away. Those are only a few stories. She picked wild mushrooms. There are mushroom stories. There are legions of Gerda and mushroom stories. And then she'd come back, she'd cook them up, she'd put them on your plate, and she'd watch. And you'd say, well, why don't you go first? She didn't. I was sitting there with, you know, 4 cell phones, watching the phone with 911, you know, in mind. But she wouldn't do it. One time we agreed, okay, we'll do it together, but then nobody can call 911, Gerda. Breaking boundaries, breaking barriers, refusing to be cowed by any of this, being intensely interested in anything she learned about mushrooms, you know. She, with books, and you're thinking, you know, they all look alike to me. Absolutely the essence of this person, and you wanted to go along with it, you know, even if you might not come home from that trip. We know that she took professional risks. We know that she took intellectual risks, and I don't think it was just about taking risks. I profoundly think it had to do with the fact that she was always trying to make a whole. One of the reasons to have women in history. You have to have your life as a part of history. You want to be a part of history. You want it to be a whole. And the only way you can do that in an unjust and broken world is to refuse the rules. You have to go right through them because they're constructed to keep you out. When I stand back and think about all those conversations we had and all her work I read and all the early stages and so forth and try to think of some kind of characterization of it, I would just say three things. One is that she was, as we know, but I still want to sort of pull it out, she was political to her marrow. In an almost like a European tradition. This is the way you be a good person. This is what you talk and care about. This is why you become a historian. Being historian is a way of changing the world. It didn't exist separate from that. She brought that to her work, as you know. That's why she wanted the profession to be so important. That's why she wanted to change it. I know many people here I know do wonderful political work, and I would say the same thing of some of you that I know. This was a profound thing with her. The second thing is, it's always related to that, but the second thing is that she was a writer in some ways before she was a historian. When I first knew her, that was her aspiration. And again, in a kind of European sense, that was a life too. It was a cultured life, it was a creative life, it was a full and demanding and entirely honorable life. And writers were already a kind of embodiment of world change, and sort of love for the world, for Gerda. It was a craft, it was an art, and again, it was world changing. She brought that together with her politics, and you get history when you bring these together. So the history was her method of doing her work and her art in the world, rather than other end. And the third, and it's ridiculous to say final, because of course we could go on forever. We want to hear you too. It struck me going back over things and thinking about this, that she was, and this was startling to me at first, that she was one of the most reflective people I've known. She wrote all those essays about what she was doing, about what history means, about her own life, about the death of her husband. And then she wrote Fireweed about her own life. Again, political and good writing. And it's about, so history is a way of coming to know ourselves Women's history was women's rights. She said that all the time. It was also hers. She was trying to make sense of her life in this world in ways that would help many others do so. And that's an extraordinarily reflective act. And I think that's one of the reasons that we were able to be such friends. She loved the way that philosophy came into that, and I loved her press back to the concrete and even sometimes to facts.
The next speaker is Linda Gordon, who needs very little introduction in this gathering, who was a friend and colleague and with Gerda for a very long time.
I actually think that every historian in the US and plenty in other countries too is indebted to Gerda. If I had time, I'd try to establish that, but I was particularly and personally indebted to her. I got hired at the University of Wisconsin only because Gerda, with her characteristic chutzpah, and that is an understatement, got a very reluctant department to do something that many of them were completely bewildered by, which was to create a spot for a second women's historian in a department. Imagine that. It seemed to many people an entirely frivolous expansion of a very marginal field. Furthermore, as long as I was there, I was a direct beneficiary of her ability to bulldoze obstacles. But also, I might add, in all of our joking about Gerda's force, she also had a very strategic and fine sense of when it was wise to go around obstacles rather than directly over them. Still, when I came there, I didn't know what I was in for. Because, and there are many people in this room that I can look at who know what I mean, but it's also true that this force that was Gerda was part of a movement that she was a part of. And in some sense, I've been dismayed, actually, by meeting young historians, and that includes people who think of gender as their field, who actually don't even know the name. And I think we're meeting a phenomenon that's a little bit like what a couple of sociologists labeled post-feminism, which is that you take for granted certain things and don't understand how they were created. Now, of course, she did not do this alone, and I think that she was part of a really extraordinary reconstruction of the whole practice of American history that actually began with the Civil Rights Movement and with African American history. But I think she was particularly important there, not only because she was a scholar, not only as a teacher, not only as a lecturer, but as an organizer. And I want to connect what she did in history with some of what she was doing before. She came to this country at age 19 in 1939, and I think two somewhat conflicting experiences really shaped her. On the one hand, she came from very considerable class privilege, which I think has a lot to do with the kind of confidence and even sense of entitlement with which she could say the things that Sarah read her saying to the history profession. On the other hand, she was a survivor of the Anschluss and the Nazi takeover of Austria. She was in jail for 6 weeks, where she says she was only survived because a very kind communist lady shared her small amount of food with Gerda. And I think the two of those experiences come together and produced a fighter. She got to this country, she married a really interesting man called Karl Lerner, who I don't have time to talk about, and they went to Los Angeles. They both joined the Communist Party. She became a national leader in an organization called the Congress of American Women, which was then attached to the Communist Party-identified Women's International Democratic Federation. She was influenced by communist theorists of male chauvinism, notably a woman called Mary Inman, who's unfortunately not well remembered. But I think also in her work with the Congress of American Women, she worked with poor black women and began to understand the limitations of some of her own assumptions and to have an ability to think much more globally about women. She was hit very hard by McCarthyism. Carl Lerner lost his job just because of the blacklist. They went back to New York. They had to scrounge for a while to earn a living. They left the Communist Party, but Gerda did not leave being an organizer and continued to work, but increasingly really committed primarily to women's organizations, which ranged from the PTA to Women's Strike for Peace. She was 38 years old when she enrolled in college for the first time. What I think I want to point out about this is that she was still an organizer when she got an academic job, and she was always an organizer. In her first job at Sarah Lawrence College, she quickly realized that merely teaching women's history would not be enough to build respect for the field, and so together with Joan Kelly, she strategized to build a program because she wanted visibility, and that continued at the University of Wisconsin, and doing this did involve fighting battles with administrators and skeptical colleagues. I have to say that I think in retrospect at Wisconsin we played good cop, bad cop very well together, and I got to be the bad cop, so in many ways, I got to be the good cop, excuse me, I'm getting my terms here. In many ways, I was what you call a free rider. I was carried along by Gerda's need to be respected, but not always to be liked. And that is a very great strength, to divest yourself of the need always to be liked, and it's a particularly great strength that is not always easy for women. What happened, though, is that this field, not only at Wisconsin, but at many other places, began to attract a large number of truly extraordinary graduate students, the kind of people who were willing to pioneer, to dig for hitherto unknown sources, to create more complex narratives into which previously disregarded actors entered without removing the better-known actors from the story you have to tell. And this is not easy, because every time you increase the number of variables or the number of analytic axes, adding gender, adding race, the complexity increases geometrically, not just arithmetically. And I think when we look around us, we see that those graduate students who were in their 20s and 30s in the 1980s are now among the finest leading historians of the US in this country. I think that intellectually what lay beneath this, the most important single thing about Gerda, both as an organizer and as a scholar, was a visceral grasp of how power worked and the relatedness of various forms of inequality and oppression. Gerda was committed in all of her work not to let people forget that difference is not just a matter of difference, it's a matter of inequality and power. And that understanding was both a strategy for how she worked, and it was also how her insights in writing history worked. I think that I'd like to say a few words about her very late years, because being in Wisconsin, I was with her through them and spent a lot of time with her. First of all, I think there was a lot of disappointment in her later years, as there has been probably for most of us in this room, because the world didn't turn out the way our hopes that were so raised in the 60s and 70s thought. She She had even some intellectual disappointments. She had some very great misgivings about the turn to gender history because she thought it displaced the focus from women as agents and therefore displaced the focus from power. And that she really wanted to cling to thinking of women as an activist, collective subject. And she also was disappointed because she looked around her and she saw the continuing neglect of women in a lot of historical scholarship. But then there were all the global disappointments, growing inequality, religious fundamentalism, the rise of xenophobia and racism, the very thing that had driven her out of Europe, rising again. These things were very, very personal for Gerda. They were not just abstract things. But she was by nature, I think, a kind of enthusiast. And any uptick in progressive social movements would lift her spirits. She was extremely thrilled with the Arab Spring. She was extremely thrilled with Occupy. And when the massive Wisconsin kind of uprising against Governor Scott Walker came about, she was just aglow. And in the fall of 2011, already very, very frail, when her son Dan came to visit, she insisted that he put her in a wheelchair and take her in the middle of a very, very cold day out to the demonstration. We all know about Gerda's walks and hikes. She used to always ask me to go for a walk, and I thought that meant strolling for an hour around the Arboretum in Wisconsin. That is not what she meant. She meant a at minimum 6-hour hike, and she was far stronger than me, well into her, I think even at age 80, she was still doing that. She would meet her daughter and they would go for hikes in the Rockies and so on. We had one hell of a time getting her to quit driving. She was always a terrible driver because she was talking and gesticulating, and for a very long time, every time we arranged to have a meal, we would insist that we would pick her up. But when she got older, it got much worse. I remember once Judy Levitt and Linda Kerber and I, around a table, spent a lot of time really pounding at her about this because we were actually worried not only about her own safety, but about the safety of others. And she was responding, "You are trying to take my independence away, and I am not going to let you." And the final compromise was she kept her car. She still had a car to the day she died, parked in the garage of Oakwood, the place where she was living. And I think the ownership of the car did a lot to protect her sense of herself, but gradually she did quit driving. It's also true that Gerda survived 2 really near-death experiences. She had a total collapse when she was abroad, in which she had multiple organ failure, and those of us hearing the messages in Madison assumed that this was the end. She lived. Then she had another, she then had breast cancer, she then had pneumonia, and the pneumonia was extremely serious. And again, we thought that she was on her way out of life, and again, she survived. So you can imagine people began to think that she just wasn't gonna die, because she just, this will was so formidable. In her last years, she became, her fragility was extraordinary, and those who didn't see her would have been quite shocked. She lost a tremendous amount of height. She became incredibly thin. It was hard for her to eat. But up through the summer of 2011, she was as sharp as a tack once you got into a conversation with her. And she would claim it was really very hard for her to read. She wasn't doing email anymore, but I would arrive, or Alan and I would arrive, or other friends in Madison would arrive, and to start a discussion, and she had read the New York Times that day much more carefully than we had. She knew everything important that was happening in the world politically. And that kind of mental toughness remained, and it was really only in the summer of 2012 that you began to see a decline and a kind of loss of short-term memory. She was never demented, never out of touch with reality. But the last major fight was about trying to get Gerda to understand that she needed to be in assisted living. She was in what's called a kind of old people's home, but she had a completely independent apartment with no assistance, and she hired some fairly incompetent people to stop in and I would go there with Judy Levitt or other people, and I would see if she hadn't taken her pills. There wasn't healthy food around. She hadn't eaten anything, and we just kept saying, Gerda, you really need it. And I kept thinking, God, if this was me, I'd love to have assisted living and have everybody taking care of me, and I wouldn't have it. Absolutely not. This independent house met her life, and I'll just conclude by saying at the very end, she did have to be hospitalized with a kind of pneumonia, and they treated her, and she got better, and they thought she was on the mend, and they released her, but they said she could not go to her apartment. She had to go to assisted living. She went into that assisted living place. She slept there one night, and she died the next day. And I have no doubt that wasn't, I'm sure that wasn't an accident. That was the force with which she lived. But I just want to say also that, Gerda would talk a lot about herself. She liked to quote herself. She liked to tell you about achievements, and she really cherished all the awards and so on. But the reason, not that it's the reason, but part of that talking about herself was that her own being was so completely fused with her career, her goals, her work, everything that women's history and really a larger vision of what history should be like was so fused with her being that when she did that kind of talking about herself, she wasn't only talking about herself, she was talking about the achievements of a whole movement and a whole profession. Thanks.
When Gerda was, at that point, they thought dying in Vienna, one of the things that her children did was to ask people to write to her, send emails, and there were thousands of those emails that went to her, and they made a huge difference. And the relationships that she had during that whole period of time were what sustained her. And one of the people who was very much a part of those relationships was Thavolia Glymph, my very dear colleague from Duke University, who will be our last speaker.
Thank you, Bill. I feel quite a bit awkward being among you, people who knew Gerda much better than I, and certainly including the people on the panel. I knew her work long before I knew her. And my friends, people who know me well, know that I am my own fiercest critic when it comes to my own work. And I thought there could be no one fiercer than me until I met Gerda. And the last 12 years of Gerda's life were the 12 years in which I learned that I knew nothing about being a fierce critic. Gerda took me under her wings, and I should say that there are many historians, particularly in this audience, who have taken me under their wings, a sort of stray person who went to graduate school and didn't have any, fellow graduate students and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, Gerda, because she was in Durham for half of the year, she sought me out when I moved to Durham. And so I know a lot about hikes. Luckily, there are no Rockies in Durham. But there are these trails in Durham that are beautiful. And I too thought, I'm used to going 3 miles behind Nancy McLean's house, now her house, and that wonderful trail. I can do that. But that was nothing for Gerda. So from the first time I read Gerda to the fall of 2012, when I last saw her in Wisconsin, and I went to see her, she's been a presence, even when she was a distant presence in my life. And I have admired her work. And I remember when I was asked to speak today, I kept thinking, I am not the person to do this, and that may well be true, but I do remember how much I appreciated her book, her documentary history of Black women. But also remember how perplexed it also made me, how at once the documents told me what Gerda was trying to say, that there was so much that had not been done, and she said explicitly that it was at that point in 1972 impossible to write a social history of Black women because there were so few monographic studies and so little research. But it also struck me then as I read, when I first read the book and her introduction to the book, and when she defined Black women historically as being dignified, passive, resisting, then I thought, well, that's kind of weird. And she wrote in that introduction that she was persuaded that Black people and white people in America, quote, represent two separate cultures with separate traditions and often diametrically opposed past experience. And she did add that she didn't think that this ruled out the notion that Black and white people shared in a common universal history, but said against the rest of her statements in that introduction, it appeared as a kind of throwaway line rather than an intellectual conviction. But now, having come to know Gerda, and also during those walks, to know something about what's never been put in any book that I know of, not even Gerda quoting herself, how much work she did for Black women's history behind the scenes, and Darlene Hine could speak more about that than I could. But I came to appreciate that, and I know how, like many scholars, Gerda's understanding of history, including Black women's history, was grounded initially in a particular moment and how it evolved. I know how much her life came to, her past lives influenced what she thought not only about Black women's history, but women's history in general. When she wrote in her autobiography of first discovering Black people, well, discovering is not the right word, first seeing Black people in 1938 in Harlem, she wrote that her first experience came at a time when she was innocent of the forms of U.S. racism, and how, because of that, she acted quite unself-consciously with the Black people in Harlem that she encountered. And she was accepted by them, and that she never felt hostility or danger. These things she learned, she wrote, have to be learned, and they are learned by every white person in America. Today, I could not do what I did then, she wrote, without self-consciousness. And so now when I read that, I am also again better able to understand where she was in 1972. That self-consciousness was apparent in 1972, but the importance of that project on Black women was nonetheless so clear when, as she then noted, as I mentioned already, that there was so little, almost nothing, on Black women's social history. What Gerda Lerner would bring to this and other work was a political commitment, honed in her own personal experience in Vienna, as Hitler prepared the war machine. that would destroy millions of lives and maim others. It was during this time, during the time spent in jail that Linda referred to, after the invasion of Austria in 1938, time spent as a refugee and exile, as a worker and an unappreciated worker, which, was pretty hard for Gerda, as a washer and a cook, that she learned firsthand something of what it means to be a person without rights and something about survival. She learned specifically what human beings are capable of, and that we are none of us innocent. What horrifies me, she wrote, about this memory of her time in Austria after the invasion of the Nazis, is how quickly and totally I came to such feelings of cruelty. They were the other side of total helplessness, of profound, unalterable fear. These memories, along with that of hundreds of survivors of the concentration camps and other cruelties, remain important for us as historians today in the work that we do. It is with these voices in mind, and the voices of Native Americans, Filipinos, and so many more, that I come to my own work on Black women and children refugees in the Civil War. And for Gerda's work, I am therefore so thankful. I am thankful for her non-sentimental book and look at her own life and struggles, even writing things that were not at all flattering to herself. How many of us can do that? Gerda, in her time, or in the time, the last 12 years of her life that I knew her, would often send me encouraging notes at a time when I was trying to finish a book and having more than a few difficulties. And her notes, and I copied and pasted a couple of them from her emails to me, were always sort of, you can do this, but also always, you better do this. That you don't really have a choice in the matter, and if you don't do it, it was like worse than my mother or father. Something horrible is going to happen to you. So she refused. She refused to let me say, "Oh, I need more time," or "Oh, I don't really, I'm not really ready to write that particular part." She just refused, and her life had given her the wherewithal to know how important refusing to allow yourself to be dragged along, how important that was, that you have to just get your butt up and move forward. And so that was, one of the most important lessons that she told me. And when she finally read my book, she wrote, "Hey, I got a copy through interlibrary loan." She said, "Shame." Shame on the libraries here in Wisconsin for not buying it. And she said, "I want to thank you for mentioning me in the thank you section, even though I contributed nothing to the book." So, Gerda knew better. It felt good, she said, to be listed. She knew that she had contributed in ways that were, could not really be put into words. And she went on to say that she read the book with interest, and I had been, over the time that she was pushing me forward to finish this book, she kept saying, "When are you going to let me read it?" And I kept thinking, never. Because I was so, she was pushing me hard, and she hadn't even seen a word of it, so I knew it was going to happen if she saw it. At any rate, and of course she had, even though she was satisfied with what I had done, she was also dissatisfied, and her dissatisfaction, every bit of what she wrote about what she was dissatisfied about was just right on and spot on. And so I wrote her back and said, the next time you can just be my co-author or something. But she always wished me the best, and I will miss her as a reluctant walking partner, and I will miss our meals and teas together. Thank you.
There's a microphone here I know people have to come and go, but I suspect there are people with stories they need to say, and we need to hear. So, feel free.
I hate to be first because I did not know her, but I have to leave, so I'm in this weird spot. I just wanted to say that her book, Black Women in White America, sits on my coffee table.
And your name is?
Oh, I'm so sorry. My name is Keely Davis Hayes, and I'm a historian. I teach women's history. When I can, at California Baptist University, I'm the only U.S. historian, so it's whatever I can sort of fit in and make sure I integrate women's history, overtly women's history, into all of my curricula. But the reason why I decided to get up is because people come and visit my home, and they're not always historians. And particularly, my Black women friends say, I didn't know anyone ever thought to write about this. And that propels me to continue to study and write myself about women's history and Black women's history. But I've seen people moved, like viscerally moved by that book on my coffee table, and so I leave it there. And so for a person I didn't know, I'm very grateful, and I've read so many of your books. I see name tags, and I know if my students were here, they would just, read like Beatlemania or something. So anyway, thank you for your kind words. I feel like I know her better, but just know that some of us haven't forgotten Gerda Lerner, and that her legacy lives on, and even people outside of the field. Just enjoy OA.
Yeah.
OA.
Thank you. My name is Glenna Matthews, and I have a story that I did share with Gerda about the impact she had on somebody very unlikely, a very right-wing student of mine at Oklahoma State University. I was teaching the survey course. It was, and one student was taking it for an honors credit, so I assigned an extra book. I assigned the Glymph sisters, because in my experience, students have loved that book. And when we got to talking about antebellum reform, I turned to him and I said, Mr. Lingenfelter, do you have anything to add based on reading about the Glymph sisters? And he said, well, I disapprove of everything they stood for. And I was just flabbergasted. I said, even ending slavery? And then I looked at her and I said, you're very brave. That was in the early 1980s. I left Stillwater. I moved to Berkeley, having given up tenure, and it was election day of 1994. I got a letter. This young man had tracked me down to apologize and say that he endorsed everything the Glymph sisters stood for. And so that's the kind of impact that book had on a fundamentalist young rural boy in Oklahoma. And if that doesn't tell you something about the ripples that come out from somebody's work. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Liz Hole, Riverview. Gerda was my advisor at Sara Evans. My introduction to her was also the Glymph sisters from South Carolina picked it up. Read it 4 hours, couldn't put it down. So I had to go and meet the woman who wrote the book and join the program, and actually was part of the graduate students who worked on that seminar at the Institute funded by the AHA. And the best thing about it is that originally the grant was to run this institute for high school teachers, integrating women's history into the curriculum, and it called for 3 graduate students, but our class was a huge group of 9, and we got into a discussion about how this was going to work, and what were the feminist implications of having to choose among the 9 for the 3, and we got into such a discussion that we neglected to go to class about 4 buildings away, and within about 10 minutes, there was Gerda standing in the doorway. We have class. We have class. We have class now. And then she sat us all down and said, what's going on? And we explained that we were just appalled that we were going to be in a situation where we have to compete for these 3 slots. And she essentially said, have we learned nothing? Challenge it to get something different. And we did, and the 9 of us participated. And so the last thing I'll say is when I went to have my first baby, I wrote her a note. I don't know what compelled me to tell her that I was going to have this baby, but it did mean I was abandoning women's history, which I've taught for 30 years. And she sent me back the most amazing note and then said, enjoy every minute of it. You know, you've got a long life ahead of you. Enjoy it.
A person who Gerda visited in Los Angeles between 1974 and 1988 to see her son Daniel, and would stay with me in my apartment. And I can't really begin to recount the stories that flow from that wonderful engagement. And I did refer a lot of stories, so I'm going to repress my own stories, but just try to make a few comments about why I think Gerda became such a great leader of what we might call the social movement that became women's history. And these are qualities that have been suggested here, but maybe it's worth noting them more explicitly. I think one aspect that's sort of obvious, almost so obvious, is her Europeanness, right?
Yeah.
I mean, she was different from us.
Yeah.
And bringing that into a bunch of American-born historians gave her a lot of power, culturally speaking. Her accent was an important part of her power. And so I think that is good to be remembered there, that she used that, and the culture that she, the difference that she was willing to always emphasize was in her favor. And I think similarly, it was her age also that gave her a great leverage. And in the moment when she hit the scene in 1968 at the AHA, there she was already 48. Is my math right? And I think of her sort of matronly sexuality as being a great advantage in that context because she was an age peer of the men who dominated the profession. And a woman, you know, a very, very full woman. So those two things, combined with, I think, her personal philosophy that you might use the Greek word virtue to describe, which maybe, you know, to the full meaning of which was be all you can be. There's something about her being everything she could be that made us feel that when we were following her, we were also being true to ourselves and being all that we could be. There was just a charisma of fullness there that was so highly individuated at the same time as these other general qualities of Europeanness and age strength. So there's those three things I just wanted to testify to as what I'm so grateful for in the way of her leadership, and what I loved about her, you know, that she shared with us so much of her energy that was so unique.
Great, thanks.
So my name is Dolores Janiewski, and I became Gerda's student that year, 68, so I guess 45 years, more or less, and I was one of the only 8 who were willing to take her course in women's history because most people thought it was very strange. And I remember one of the things she asked us in that class, what was the most important thing to have liberated women in the last 20 years, she said. And of course we said what everyone would think we would say, the pill. And she said, the laundromat. Men can do the laundry. And that was the kind of person she was, that she did think differently and outside the box. And my last I was helping her research the year Carl was dying, and he was a very important person in her life, quite obviously. But she wanted to do the research to keep herself going, as she was also dealing with him. And the very last memory I have is when she was writing Fireweed, and being Gerda, she decided she had to research her own life. And by the time I was there, she was into 1957, and she was looking at a documentary that she and Carl had made, which was about the first march on Washington in 1957, the one that most people don't know, where Martin Luther King spoke, and so forth. But she and Carl had done this documentary, so they were very engaged in this long movement, as well as personal struggles that they had had to overcome. So I think there was strength, and there was also vulnerability, and there was the ability to try to overcome and to survive, which I think helped her escape from Austria when her mother ultimately died in France, and also made her aware of the struggles of other people. But the person that taught her to think about women's history is her friend Virginia Brodeen, whom I have met. And they were housewives together in California in the early 1940s. And Virginia was interested in women's history, and she began to discuss with Gerda as they ironed and argued. And the arguing was sometimes so loud that the neighbors could hear. So it was very quintessentially Gerda, doing both the domestic but also the intellectual, and bringing those gifts to other people.
I'm Lisa Meyer. I'm at the College of William and Mary, but I was graduated from Wisconsin in 1990. I think I'm just really I'm feeling my age these days. I'm in my 50s, not just 50. I'm in my 50s. Well, I want to say there's so many things I want to say in terms of Gerda, and I'm going to keep it very brief. I recall coming as a graduate. The first time I met Gerda as an entry-level graduate student, I was for the queers in the audience, I was wearing shorts and a tank top that said All-American Boy, which at the time was a fairly festive, and the motorcycle, the festive gay label at the time. Had a big lapis around my neck because I was also a lesbian, very in your face, kind of that sort of thing. And I had a purple tail. This is blonde, but it was purple. And I say all this because one of the last time I saw Gerda, what she talked about was that she was not afraid of me. That didn't scare her. That I had that tail, that I was so inappropriately attired for graduates for a professional school outing. And that was my relationship with Gerda in a lot of ways. It was the push, and I mean, she was a fierce critic and a fierce advocate. Both things. They were co-equal in terms of how she approached education and how she approached graduate education. In terms of, I remember her pulling me by my ear out of my comprehensive exam afterwards because she felt that I didn't demonstrate enough knowledge of women's history. I was fine on military history and American history, but I wasn't quite do enough with women's history. And the reason that was because the previous year had been sort of a feeding frenzy on people who had just focused on women's history, and so we had strategized about that anyway. But I do recall that. I also recall, I know along with other people, how many people did she tell, if we can see hands raised, that we were illiterate in our native tongue. That was another of her favorites. And tone deaf, yeah, but these are things, yeah, she was right. And so, but when we're talking about this, these are things that are sort of, this is what I'm saying, critic and advocate, both. In terms of inspiring and pushing. The last thing I will say is that Gerda was not initially sort of on the bandwagon in terms of sexuality as a potential field. Yes, is that an understatement? And so she, we put on a Lesbian History Week, and she wanted very much for Blanche Cook, who was our speaker, as well as Liz Kennedy and Alan Davis, talking about their book before it came out, Woods, Leather, Slippers of Gold, in the Buffalo witch film community. Gerda very much wanted Blanche to come out and talk about and do her impersonation, well, not impersonation, do Eleanor Roosevelt, be Eleanor Roosevelt, and she didn't want Blanche to talk about Eleanor and Lorraine Hickok. She didn't want that to be part of what was going on. And that was a struggle. Let's just be honest about that. There were years at Wisconsin where Gerda was not, and I'll just leave it, not on board in terms of people doing sexuality, and did not want you doing lesbian history. She didn't think you'd get a job. She didn't think it was something that was necessarily meaningful as a field. But again, we can't end there because she changed her mind. And she changed her mind in part because she started, because she listens and she engages. So she did listen to us. She did engage. And where I'll end is when I think it was one of my first Berks events. My first Berkshire Stories of Women Conference of Women Historians. I always figure out the name. But she introduced me to Liz Kennedy and said, "This is my student, Lisa Weiner, and she studies lesbians." And so, do you know what I'm saying? There's, it comes back to it, even though, but it took a while to get there, and the getting there was like, but she did get there eventually. So and then I'll just leave it.
We have about 12 minutes left, so
I'll be quick.
But everybody who's standing up should say something.
I'll be quick. I'm Mary Beth Norton. I didn't know Gerda as well as most people on the panel, certainly. I knew her off and on through historical professional connections, but the story I want to tell, I am led to tell by so many people here who've talked about the importance of the book Black Women in White America. Because I was at the session at the AHA or the OAH where that book was introduced, and where Gerda came up and talked about it. And she was creamed, there is no other way to describe it, by black women who said, "How can you dare do this? How can you, a white woman," and remember when this is in the early 70s, "how can you, as a white woman, dare to appropriate our history?" And Gerda stood there and took it, and she said there was no one else to do it. It needed to be done. And she did that with great dignity. And it was a very difficult session, I can tell you, to attend. I was a young assistant professor at that session, and it was painful. But Gerda was amazing. That's what I want to say.
I was also one of the early women's history students at Wisconsin in the program that Gerda set up, and there is so much to say, as people have said, so I'm glad there are going to be several other different kinds of events over the next few years to talk about Gerda and share stories from her life and her impact on all of us in the world. I guess somehow as I'm sitting here and thinking, what do I want to say here, am coming back to a conversation that I was having with Laura McEnany yesterday about courage and thinking about Gerda in this context, because especially for people who don't know her, you imagine this person who sort of came pretty forward, like this Greek goddess or something that, you know, was so indomitable and couldn't be stopped. And I remember Gerda as a person of deep feeling, not often expressed, but you could tell when she was afraid, and you could tell when she was hurt. And when she set up that program in women's history at the University of Wisconsin, she was afraid, and that's why she drove us as hard as she did. It wasn't just that she didn't want to be embarrassed by us, although there was probably some of that too, but it was because what she was doing was so profoundly important, and she really wanted to transform the profession. She wanted to change the way people think, and so she drove everyone else as hard as she drove herself. But I guess, you know, we were having this conversation about things in life, and I think about this with Gerda, that courage is not about being free from fear. It's about knowing the fear, owning it, and getting through to the other side of it to do what needs to be done in the way that we just heard about. And I think that was one of probably the greatest gifts that she gave to all of us, is to find that place in ourselves. And Lord knows she could drive me pretty hard, but what she was really doing was teaching us all to kind of drill down and find that place in us that was the place of passion that she had, and of commitment to understand what our unique missions were in the world, and they were all different, and God bless Gerda, she knew that all the time, but she wanted to strengthen us. I mean, she wanted people to have normal personal lives, she wanted them to have fun, that's why she made people walk, because she wanted us to all develop good habits like she had, but I mean, she really wanted people to be whole people who could be there for the marathon that this would take. And I think it's so important that Linda talked about Gerda as an organizer too, because that was key to everything else she did. I mean, she was an extraordinary scholar, and Lord knows she was rigorous, and she would really, I was going to say crack the whip, which is an awful metaphor, but for Gerda, it's the apt metaphor, I think. She could be so tough, but, wait, where was I just going? But the organizing, she was always on that organizing mission of what, you know, I was thinking about this morning, she was like the good Lenin, you know, it was always like, what is to be done? What is the next thing? And she was getting you to what that next thing was. But she also had such a respect for the plurality of ways that people would go. And I just want to say that too, because, you know, most of the people here, I assume, are historians and people who stayed in the profession. But I think Gerda was in some ways proudest of the people who went into other arenas. So one of the women who was in our program, Florence Deacon, was a nun and went off and did this very transformative work in her order, and went to the Beijing conference, and she's one of the nuns on the bus. You know, she was on the news. And Gerda, you know, I didn't see Gerda talk about flow, but I know she just would have been over the moon about what Flo was doing, or about Molly McGregor setting up women's history, or a friend of hers, Michelle Couturier, who went out and became a union organizer. I mean, Gerda, we were all her children in a certain way, and she was so proud of people and so welcomed the news. But she really did just come back to this theme of courage. She wanted everyone to push themselves in the way that she also demanded of herself in the pushing. And so it was painful at times, but I think, you know, I'm glad that I had somebody like that in my life to make me push.
Thank you.
I'm going to do a Gerda number, which is Gerda would never talk to an audience with her back to the audience. So, forgive me, I'm Alice Kessler-Harris, and I wanted to say a few words about Gerda's early years in the academic community. I've known Gerda since 1969, and I precede my remarks by saying I had a very emotionally charged relationship with Gerda. We shared a lot. We were both immigrant refugees. We had started life in other languages. You know, I could go on, but I start by saying that this was a woman who I deeply loved and, like a mother, sometimes deeply hated. That's Gerda. Let me start by saying that I met Gerda in the CCWHP. It was 1969. I had just got my graduate degree. The women's movement was just beginning. There was a New York meeting of the Coordinating Committee of Women in the Historical Profession. Gerda and Annette Baxter were chairing it. I'd heard by the grapevine that the meeting was going to take place at Barnard, and I went off to this meeting, young person, and there sitting around the table was Gerda Lerner, Annette Baxter,
Blanche Wiesen-Cook, Joan Kelly, and several other people of that ilk. Now anybody who knows any of those people will know that they are not quiet people. But there was only one voice in that room. And I don't have to tell you whose it was. It was that voice. That was my introduction to Gerda. I then got to know her a little bit, but I really got to know her in 1974. I was teaching at Hofstra University. I had just got tenure. I had signed the contract for what became my first book, Out to Work. And one evening there was a phone call. It was Gerda on the phone. Joan Kelly, she told me, had just resigned to go back. She was leaving the Women's History program at Sarah Lawrence. She resigned to go back to City College. They had an opening for a historian of women. I should come. I said to her, I have a job, I have tenure, what am I doing going there? She said to me, you will never be a historian of women unless you come to Sarah Lawrence. Well, maybe she was right. I went to Sarah Lawrence and look what happened. That was the beginning of a 2-year association with Gerda in which we became very good friends. And I could tell you, well, my memory of Gerda, it's not about courage, although I agree she had it in great quantity. It's not even about academic insight, it's about sheer stubbornness. That Gerda was capable of sticking her ground, whether she was right or whether she was wrong. And that made working with her both a great pleasure and very funny. So I'll tell you some Gerda stories, just one or two. Here's one story where Gerda calls a meeting for whatever time it was, 4:30 in the afternoon. Somebody talked about, Nancy just talked about how Gerda really wanted things to be right. This is Sarah Lawrence College. She has just founded, and she's got a grant for the first Women's History MA in the country. She is not only very proud of this, but she is very scared that it will fail, and she needs to prove something. So she cracked the whip. I was there, she was there, Amy Swerdlow, who was then the assistant director of the program, Barbara Engel, a Russian historian of women. Gerda calls the meeting for 4:30. 3 of us are sitting around the room. Gerda walks in 5 minutes late. Unapologetically, she sits down. She hasn't even taken off her coat yet when 1 minute later, Barbara Engel walks in and Gerda looks up at her and says, "You're quite late. I don't know why you're so late," she says. At which Barbara Engel crawled under the table, of course. Another Gerda story. We have a late night meeting. Gerda's out in the, we've all left. It's a foggy, dark night. Gerda goes to the parking lot to get her car. I'm going to the parking lot to get my car to drive home with Barbara Engel. Gerda comes storming back into the building. What's the matter, Gerda? We say, well, she says, somebody left the lights on in my car. My favorite story is around 1974. Gerda and a bunch of other people finally get Columbia to establish a faculty seminar on women's history, faculty seminar, which is still running, Women in Society seminar. And whatever she's done this seminar, and the first seminar session meets, and I hear about it through the grapevine. Now I'm teaching with her at Sarah Lawrence, and there's this Women in Society seminar. So, Gerda comes to work the next day, and I say to her, Gerda, there's a faculty seminar at Columbia that I hear you started. Can I come? She says, oh no, that's only for significant people. Right, well, ouch, right. But so there's on the one hand the Gerda sort of stubbornness. On the other hand, the next month I show up at the seminar, Gerda puts her arms around me and she forgets that she's sad that I'm not there. So I want to say about Gerda, there are two sides to Gerda, and both sides were equally powerful and equally important. There was the side that pulled us to her because when she said, which she did all the time, and acted on the belief that understanding women's history could change the world. She really believed that understanding women's history could change the world. And we believed it too, I think, that we really believed that that was the way we would go. And there was a piece of that Gerda that we loved and admired, wanted to follow to the ends of the earth, including giving up one job and taking another, because that was the thing to do. And then there was the other piece of Gerda, the piece of Gerda that was, in a sense, so insecure that she had to be right about everything. And she was right often enough that she could change the world. So she could, and she did, establish this master's program in women's history at Sarah Lawrence, which is still running, which she never intended to be a vehicle to train historians, but she intended as a vehicle for women to come and understand their past so they could go into the world to become political people or organizers or group people. That was Gerda Lerner, the Gerda Lerner who practically every summer had some great idea for an institute or a seminar for teachers, a seminar for women leaders, out of which came the National Women's History Day. Molly McGregor was there, and that's where it came from. There was the Gerda Lerner who, in the early 1980s, got Black Rock, Wisconsin, I think it was Black Rock, Wisconsin, to sponsor a 3-day seminar for teachers, for graduate teachers of women's history, to which we all came and did our bibliographies. We were already all teaching women's history then.
Right.
I mean, it was a Gerda Lerner who just kept pushing us, who never let go of us. So I'm sorry, I've talked too long, but I want to conclude by saying one thing. So I'm standing before you, as a past president of this organization, with more ribbons, as you can see, than anybody else, all of which proves that Gerda was right. But the bottom ribbon, is the quintessential Gerda comment. I know you can't see it, but after all these ribbons, the one on the bottom says, "My ribbon is better than yours."
Thank you. That was a perfect ending. Let's go in peace and sisterhood and solidarity and carry Gerda with her and fight with her when we need to and draw on her strength whenever we possibly can. Thank you.